It is a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk about the European Union because here in New York and my perch on Wall Street, it's just not a popular topic. When I deal with money managers, it's always about China, Brazil, and the BRICS and so forth. And whenever I say, let's talk about Europe, they kind of glaze over or they head to the back room or out the door. So, but it's emblematic of, to me, a relationship that's been devalued perhaps or just not taken seriously by the United States in particular. I just got back from Europe and they're all excited about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And I spent the week just kind of tapping down and pushing back expectations. I'd like to hear from you about what you think about TTIP and the odds of this happening. But to kind of set the table before we open up the discussion, I've done a lot of research on the transatlantic economy, the commercial arteries that connect the United States with virtually every country and region of the world, whether it's the United States and Asia, NAFTA, United States and Latin America, the Middle East and so forth. But when you add it all up and aggregate it and you slice and dice it, the largest commercial artery in the world, bar none, is the one that connects the United States and the European Union together. It's about $5.3 trillion in commercial activity. And by the way, I have a lot of these figures I'll be using tonight. I'm not sure if you've seen this before. You can go to the Center for Transatlantic Relations website and I believe download these publications that Dan Hamilton and myself do every year. We do a survey every year. We kind of take a feel for what investors are doing with their money, where are they investing, where are they putting the money to work vis-a-vis Europe or Asia or Africa and so forth. But at the end of the day, and it's kind of the best kept secret, that kind of always amazes me, how companies, investors don't realize that. And I'll give you a good example. A lot of people think Coca-Cola is a play on the emerging markets, and it is, right? I mean, Coca-Cola, the more product they sell in the emerging markets, the better the earnings. But at the end of the day, where's Coca-Cola's largest market? The European Union, believe it or not. And that's true for Cisco, it's true for a lot of companies, because at the end of the day, when you look at the kind of the trade, where the wealth is, where the markets are, where there's been liberalization and kind of a convergence of regulations, it's between the United States and Europe, and it's created the bedrock of the global economy. There's no stronger relationship. And we're building out a relationship now with China and Brazil and the BRICS and so forth. But when you look at the thickness, you look at how deep and integrated and embedded US companies are in Europe and European companies are in the United States, there's no other relationship like that. There's no other relationship like that. So that's kind of the good news, because there's this huge foundation by which to build off. The bad news, so to speak, right now is that it's a lopsided partnership, because Europe's in recession and the United States is growing around 2%. 2% isn't great, but it's better than nothing, right? The IMF just came out and downgraded the European outlook, negative growth, slight contraction in 2013, another contraction in 2014. So what does that mean for the United States? It means the US right now, we're running at least $100 billion trade deficit with the EU. It's typically in balance, right? Ebbs and flows, but it's become increasingly lopsided because we're growing and they're not. They're importing more to us than we're exporting back. And so you see it clearly in the trade numbers, the kind of the asymmetrical nature of the transatlantic activity right now. You also see it in corporate earnings. It's earnings season on Wall Street, and a lot of companies, it's not surprising anymore because they're coming out and saying North America was good, Latin America okay, China softened, but Europe's killing us in that sense, because there's still tremendous amount of angst and anxiety over in Europe about how do they grow, how do they come out of their own debt problems. And that's going to be, I think, a continuing issue. And it worries me with TTIP, and I'll talk about TTIP in a moment, because I think if Europe's not growing and we are, and the benefits seems to be lopsided and more towards Europe than ours, it's going to be a tough sell on Capitol Hill to make this work. So I'm worried about kind of the near-term macroeconomics of a trade agreement, because when you look at and kind of delve into the numbers and the profits and the trade, it's not we're getting short end of the stick. It's just a cyclical downturn that paints the picture of a lopsided relationship, when in reality it's not. Europe is hugely important for corporate America. It's hugely important for US workers, for a lot of US communities, states, and so forth. And if you just look at the EU onto itself, and as I said, it's a very unappreciated economic body, economic entity. But just to give you some numbers, it's the largest economy in the world, the EU. You throw in Croatia, it's even bigger by a rounding error. But nevertheless, the EU is larger collectively than the United States. When you look at the economy, it's very wealthy, right, as well. There's a lot of people there, potential consumers. There's very competitive economies, whether it's Finland, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's Germany, the Netherlands. There's a lot of skilled labor we need to access and leverage as well. Life sciences, aerospace, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, capital machinery, you name it, first cutting edge industries, and we need to be there and leverage and participate in these markets. And also with the EU, the periphery, when you look at it, kind of the Russia, Central Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and even Sub-Saharan Africa, that's a launching pad for U.S. companies positioned in Europe to reach into, right? Why do corporations always they always call it that European revenues are, it's Europe and the Middle East, Africa. Well, because that's why, they treat it as one coherent geography, and whatever they're doing in the EU, so to speak, is then sent to other parts of the periphery. So it's very important. In the embeddedness of U.S. companies, I'll give you an example of how deeply integrated some of these economies are with corporate America. If you look at Ireland, now Ireland is what, 4.5 million people? But it's one of the largest software exporters in the world. Why? Because there's a lot of U.S. companies over there leveraging that English-speaking, high-skilled labor force to send product back out through the UK and the rest of Europe and to the world. And right now, believe it or not, the largest export platform for U.S. companies globally, right? So U.S. affiliates set up in locations and they export to other markets, right? Typically to the U.S., but more so generally to other parts of the world, is Ireland. Right? We export more out of Ireland as a factor of like 2 or 3 times more than we export out of China, or even Mexico for that matter. And right now, U.S. affiliates, we do some rough numbers. Believe it or not, U.S. affiliates operating in Ireland, they account for about almost 25-30% of Ireland's GDP. That's how embedded we are right now in Ireland. And vice versa, when you look at the automobile industry here in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry, banks up until recently, their European presence in the U.S. is very important. Go down to the BMW plant in South Carolina. Go to the Mercedes plant in Alabama. Go to Volkswagen's plant in Tennessee. Why do you say I go there? Because they're creating good jobs, good incomes, paying taxes, and being part and parcel of a community that's helped driving growth and wages in very important sectors in very important parts of the U.S. economy. So this is a very deep relationship based on foreign direct investment and not trade, right? And that's hugely important because we typically measure bilateral relationships based on exports and imports. I mean, I guess we've been doing it for 200 years. That's how we always think about it. But companies in regions of the world don't trade as much as they're embedded and they invest, right? Volkswagen figured out that if they want to be competitive in the United States, they had to follow in the footsteps of BMW and Mercedes. They had to be in the U.S. You've got to be near your customers. After sales service, marketing, financing, everything comes with that. You build where you sell. And that's a deeper relationship. Shallow relationship is arm's length trade. Ours is much deeper, and we see that continuing. And when it is deeper, it's mutually beneficial because you're driving trade, you're driving investment, which creates jobs and incomes and taxes and so forth. So my premise here is that the largest, deepest commercial relationship known to mankind on planet Earth in the United States is with Europe, and no one knows about it. No one cares about it. As you know, any relationship needs nurturing. You have to kind of care about the partner once in a while. You got to say some nice things once in a while, to and fro. And the last decade has been very difficult for the transatlantic partnership, right? I mean, if you go back to 9/11, Europe stood shoulder to shoulder with us right afterwards. But then shortly afterwards, on Congress, all of a sudden, because the French and the Germans were against our U.S.-led war in Iraq, there was a lot of tension. Kind of the foreign security, the military aspect kind of overshadowed the economics. And you had people, what was it on Capitol Hill? The Congress people, very busy on Capitol Hill, decided that we weren't going to be French fries served anymore on Capitol Hill. I think, they're going to be called potatoes or something. You had a backlash against the French here, even in New York City, bar owners pouring French wine down out into the streets. It was emblematic of a strained relationship. Most people didn't realize, many on Capitol Hill, in media and so forth, how deep the commercial ties were. And then also, you know, the Europeans, the United States was upset with Europe, and we kind of worked our way through it. And then, lo and behold, September 2008, Wall Street blows up. The U.S. made financial crisis, brings the world economy to its knees. Then the Europeans got really upset. And they said some nasty things that upset us about our financial markets, the risk-taking, the cowboys on Wall Street and so forth, and they kind of pushed back. So we've always had kind of differences over the last couple of years. But at the same time, U.S. corporations, European corporations, where have they put their money month in and month out, year in and year out? In each other's markets. Because we're large and wealthy. And this is a key point. Corporations invest overseas to access skilled labor and wealthy consumers. They're not chasing cheap labor in general, right? There's cheap labor over in New Jersey. There's plenty of it across this country. So corporations do not go overseas for low-cost labor. Some industries do, textiles for instance, but in general, overall speaking, empirical studies show that what drives investment, foreign direct investment, is similarities between wealth and economic development, and it's more about accessing wealthy consumers. And the European Union is 500 million strong, we're 320 million roughly strong. Now what about China? What about the BRICS? Let's talk about that for the moment. Doesn't all the US investment go there? No, just look at the statistics. Our footprint in Ireland, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in the UK, even Poland for that matter, Poland's becoming very popular, it's much greater than it is in Russia, Brazil, India, and China. Why is that? Well, because when you talk about Poland or Germany or Netherlands, they're wealthy markets and they want to receive this foreign direct investment. We can trust that we'll get our money back. We can trust that they'll respect intellectual property rights. We can expect them not to take the technology one day and create the same product the next day under a different company logo, as they do in some parts of the world. So the investment to China and to the BRICS in general isn't as large as a lot of people think it is. In fact, it's a lot smaller. And relationship is still developing. You know, it's becoming more foreign direct investment led instead of trade. But when you look at where companies put their money to work, it has to be in areas where there's the ease of doing business, right? It's not easy doing business in Brazil. If you notice in China, it's becoming even more difficult to do business because the Chinese, they subsidize the state-owned enterprises, they give them free capital, not free capital, subsidized capital, but they want the national champions and so forth. In Russia, I mean, everything's skewed towards some big national energy and gas companies as opposed to foreign participation. So that's very important, and it's not well understood, and a lot of our statistics point to the fact that where companies vote with their capital is in other developed economies, right? It's developed to develop. Now there's more developing to developing, there's more developing to the US and Europe as well, and that's a very dynamic component. I hope that expands, but at the end of the day, just listen to the corporations as they report earnings in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks, and you'll realize how important Europe is to their bottom line, profits. Conversely, why is Germany, why is the Netherlands, the UK, Spain, some cases, why are those equities at all-time highs, albeit the economy's in recession? Because a lot of good European multinationals, they have escaped the worst of the European downturn by being embedded here in the United States, right? You look at BMW, look at Audi, Volkswagen, you look at Mercedes. Why are they doing pretty well profit-wise? Because it's not just about China, but they're here in the United States that's growing and expanding. So we've been a huge stabilizer for a lot of the European corporations over the last couple years to help kind of buffet their profits, keep the employment levels where they are, and it's been mutually beneficial for not only the corporation, say, Mercedes, but also the workers down in Alabama that will earn a good wage. So that leads me to TTIP. I'll kind of end with TTIP, and let's just throw it open for a conversation. What is TTIP? TTIP, the idea has been around for quite some time. I've been in many meetings over in Europe and just thinking this is never going to happen. But believe it or not, the president's behind it. The administration, outgoing administration, a lot of the officials at the State Department really pushed hard. And President Obama said the magic words in the State of the Union address. And quite frankly, right up until some people say a couple minutes before, he wasn't quite sure he was going to go down that road. But nevertheless, he's got the Europeans all whipped up into a lather about doing this big trade deal. This would be the biggest trade deal ever accomplished, right? And then there's risk there because it does kind of supersede Doha, multilateralism, and there's talk now of mega regional deals and so forth. Because remember, the United States not only wants to do a deal with Europe, they're also looking to do a deal with Asia as well, ex-China and India, which doesn't make any sense to me, but we'll talk about that some other time. Nevertheless, TTIP is very interesting. It'd be very difficult because tariffs are pretty low already in most cases between the United States and Europe. And that's what's helped drive trade and investment and the embeddedness of each other's economies over the last couple of years, couple of decades for that matter. The real issue is non-tariff barriers. I mean, how do you kind of harmonize and standardize product safety rules and regulations? Can we get over agriculture? Can we look at kind of drugs? If it's approved in Brussels, does that mean it's approved in Boston? Right, and auto safety. So if you could harmonize a lot of these industries with mutual recognition, for instance, okay, if it's recognized in Germany, it's recognized in Belgium, and it's recognized in California or Georgia. Why is that so important? What's the benefits? It would hugely lower the cost of doing business for a lot of US corporations and European corporations. I mean, packaging onto itself is hugely expensive because you got to pack it one way in Europe and you got to pack it another way here in the United States. When you kind of harmonize and reduce those costs, what do? You increase profits, which in most cases leads to more investment, more jobs, more income, and even more greater embeddedness. And so whether it's e-commerce, whether it's e-health, and so forth, airlines, there's a lot of upside here. Services, I'm not sure what they're going to do with financial services. That's a tricky one because there's a lot going on there between the United States, what the UK's doing, Germany, Basel III, and so forth. We'll see if that passes muster. But the non-tariff barriers, this is very rarely talked about or tried, right? I mean, when the United States does a deal with Mexico, it's like, okay, the tariffs are very high in all these industries. We'll lower them if you do this. And then you go forward. When it's developed negotiations, you have to talk about non-tariff barriers. Or what else is there to talk about? Because most of the tariff barriers are already lower. They're 5 to 7%. Not in agriculture, but that's, set that aside for the moment. So TTIP could be kind of a new blueprint by which countries or regions go out and negotiate with each other and push even further more trade and investment, and therefore globalization. I mean, globalization is still with us. Martin Wolf has a good piece out, I think today or yesterday, talking about globalization in transition. Yeah, it's always in transition. There's always something happening, but the bicycle keeps rolling forward, and that's hugely important. Now, TTIP, we'll see if it's going to happen. I mean, the French, being the French, they wanted to kind of spoil the party even before it started, by saying, all right, we're not going to do audiovisual and culture and movies and so forth. And they kind of set them aside. But we got U.S. agricultural interests very adamant that Europe has to eat or plant genetically modified crops. And quite frankly, the Europeans don't believe, or they believe that whatever we're eating is killing us because it's genetically modified. And then you can get big arguments late into the night about whether it's scientifically proven or not. So there's a lot of hang-ups here. The data privacy issue is huge, right? Data privacy is going to be huge because if we're not going to allow more e-commerce, the content, then Google, Cisco, a lot of U.S. companies, Amazon, they're going to lose out if we can't get to that point. So there's a lot at stake. They want to do it on one tank of gas, quote unquote, which means what? By the midterm election in 2014, and also that's also when the European Commission rolls over. And so you have to have this done pretty quickly. I don't think it'll be done, but hopefully that'll show some progress by specific sectors that keeps the negotiation rolling. And remember, why one tank of gas? Because Doha, we're 12 years in, over a decade, and it's failed. Let's just kind of raise our hands and be kind of adults about and say that that this is Doha, the first multilateral trade agreement to fail in the post-war era. And that's why you do see these bilateral deals, mega deals emerging. So TTIP to me is important. It's not important in terms of opening up sectors, lowering costs, driving cross-border trade and investment, and therefore creating more employment and incomes. It's very important for the United States and Europe, as I said, to kind of revive this relationship. It's a kind of a stale. I've always said the EU and US relationship, it's kind of like a tired married looking for a spark. Yeah, we know each other so well, you kind of like pass in the night, hello, goodbye, go to sleep, hello, goodbye. And it needs a spark, and this is the spark, hopefully, that gets the United States excited about Europe, and Europe excited about the United States, and we go deeper into this relationship. It will pay off for a lot of US companies and European companies. What I don't like here in the United States, no one's talking about it. No one sees the benefit, right? And when we've got a $100 billion trade deficit running now with the EU, a lot of people are going to scratch their head and say, well, wait a minute, why would we open our markets even more to more competition from Europe when it's a lopsided relationship? We can't think of it that way. More importantly, if the United States and Europe could come together and set standards when it comes to government procurement rights, intellectual property right enforcement, e-commerce, e-health, automobile standards, even carbon emissions. If the United States and Europe could agree and say, okay, here's the standards, here's the regulations by which we're going to agree to in each other's markets, who's the big loser? Who's the people that have to worry, like, oh my God? The Chinese, the Brazilians, and the Indians, and so forth. The emerging markets, because if you want to play in our league, play in our field, the United States and Europe, if we do this deal, the threshold just went up. Does everyone see that? That's hugely important. The Chinese are not happy about what's coming down the pipe if we get this right. Now, they're probably saying, like, there's no way these guys are going to get their act together. We'll worry about it later. But if we did get it together, we could set the standards globally for a lot of industries that by which others would have to follow, right? Does everyone see that? It's very, very important. We, United States and Europe, have always set the global rules of engagement since out of the post-war era. The global governance, trade, WTO, GATT, I mean, that was US, European driven. Japan was there as well. Now we have another opportunity to kind of set the standards that others will have to follow by. Because if you're a Chinese company and you don't meet the standards in our market or Europe's market, then you're boxed out of the wealthiest market in the world with the largest GDP, and you're not going to make any money. Does everyone see that? That's hugely important. So here's a chance for the United States and Europe to kind of reset global standards for a host of industries that the emerging markets would have to live up to, or they wouldn't be part of this great economy. That's hugely important. So there's geostrategic importance to these negotiations. And that's recognized by the negotiation, and they know that. But can they follow through? Can we get over genetically modified food? Can we get over the fact that some cheese in Europe may not be good for you? We think it's not good for you, so that we won't import it. It's both sides. We're guilty. Both parties are guilty of protectionism and protecting certain industries. Why can't British Airways fly to New York and then fly to Cleveland? If they want to go to Cleveland, I'm sure maybe that's a bad example. Continue on to LA. They can't, right? They can only go to New York and then they got to turn around and go back. So if they do start to come to New York and they go on to LA, well, how's United going to feel about that? How's that going to work? So there's a lot at stake here, and I'll kind of wrap up by saying that there's this marriage, this relationship has a little spark in it now, and I just hope that spark turns into a flame and really drives the economy, both sides, because this is a game changer. The TTIP could be a game changer. It's a huge new initiative that I hope the president backs. Congress can get over and pass it. The EU has to bless it as well. There's a lot of stumbling blocks, but this is hugely important. So I'll stop there, and I'm just going to thank my host for having the opportunity to talk about this, because to me, it's hugely, hugely important. This is about the United States and Europe and the future of the global economy. That's how important it is right now. The French are, they're not competitive. They are not competitive. Their biggest problem is, remember too, have an appreciation for the European side. You're talking unemployment rates, 13, 14, 15%. In Spain, the youth unemployment rate's 55%. It's incredible. It's incredible Europe's not lit up more by social instability than what we have seen. But you're right. So how do we pacify the French? We make some concessions, maybe mutual recognition, but what I didn't like about the French is right out of the box, they were putting a marker in the sand. And the US side told the Europeans over and over, let's start this with everything on the table, everything on the table. And that was tough for, there's a lot of, there's a lot of people here in the United States against, agriculture. There's other like pharmaceuticals, automobile safety standards that we may have to adopt and vice versa. So I think corporations are on board, but they've got their own little special interests. Mutual recognition might be one way around it. We'll see. It's going to take some creativity, though. But you're right. In agriculture, I mean, this is where Doha founded, right? I mean, yeah, Doha was killed by agriculture, right? What do farmers make up as a percent of world GDP? Like 2%? Right? I mean, it's incredible that we're still hostage to farmers in the 21st century when it comes to doing trade and services, which is where we need to go, in goods. And I don't think we should carve it out because there is if you're Monsanto, you want this deal to go through with genetically modified food, agriculture, and so forth. So it'll be interesting. It'll be, and I'll be honest with you. This is my opinion, not Johns Hopkins University, where I'm a fellow. I give TTIP 1 in 3 chance of succeeding. 1 in 3, a 1 in 3 chance of succeeding. Does anyone think it's going to be more than that? If you do, tell me how. But there's momentum. There's momentum, and I hope the president's got to get on board and push more. But he's letting negotiators do what they're doing. But the key, I think, for the United States to accept this, these very specific, is that when we get around to the mid 2014, say a year from now and beyond. And this economy still has to be growing. This economy has an unemployment rate below 7%. And Europe's got to start showing some signs of life. Because if we have an unemployment rate going in the wrong direction, the protectionist bone of all, the protectionist feelings and so forth of Congress will come to the fore. And we need trade promotion authority, right? TPA. And the president hasn't even asked for it yet. It has to be an up or down vote. So there's a lot at risk here that could be derailed. And to me, this is the last chance. This is the last chance for the West, United States and Europe, to tell the rest of the world how we're going to do things. And believe me, the rest, right, the rise of the rest, they're banking, they've got their fingers crossed that we'll blow it, that we'll split and splinter, and then they're going to pop a lot of champagne on our failure because that's their success. So, and everyone knows that, but can we get over the French saying right out of the backs, oh no, our industry needs to be protected because if we watch American television, it'll melt our brains. I mean, good question, to be determined. The Europeans are really excited about this, and I told them, listen, you just can't hitch your wagon to the United States and think we're going to carry it to the promised land. It's not going to work that way. Because we've got our own problems, with wages and unions in some parts and so forth. But the Europeans are excited. That's a good thing. They're negotiating, I think, in earnest. And the United States is competitive. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for stagnant, stale Europe to kind of jump on America's bandwagon because whether it's the skilled labor of the southern eastern part of this country, the natural gas, I mean, right, a lot of foreign direct investments coming into the U.S. The Europeans are paranoid and petrified of the Chinese and the competition that's coming out of India at some point, which hasn't shown up yet. So I think, but is Europe, going back to your earlier, is Europe in structural decline? I don't know. I'm not. It doesn't have to be. But they're way behind when it just comes to basic cellular service, right? I mean, cell phone service. I mean, it's just simple stuff. E-commerce. Unless you go to Estonia. See, the problem with problem with Germany, or the problem with Europe is who speaks for Europe. And is Europe Greece, which is broke and now an emerging market, or is it Germany, one of the most competitive economies on earth, or is it Switzerland that's just indifferent, neutral, and who cares? Everything's fine. They're kind of they got their own little thing going. So that's the hard part. But I do remember a decade ago, everyone writing off Germany. Everyone wrote off Germany. And they came back and they got the labor reform underway. They kick-started more they went back to basics, making stuff. And I just got back from Ireland. Ireland's done a lot of heavy lifting, internal adjustments with wages, with rents and electricity. They're very competitive, and that's not just a corporate tax rate. I know that's important, but they've done a nice U-turn. I think Italy and Spain will start to be more competitive. Here's a good example. Germany, you got to get over this election, right? Merkel's got to be quiet. She doesn't want anything blowing up here between now and the election in September. So we're waiting for okay, just get the election over, because hopefully she can start being a little more proactive about more growth, debt forgiveness. I mean, you have to forgive Greece's debt, right? There has to be a massive write-off, or they're just condemned forever, basically. I mean, you just leave. I mean, why would you stay there? So Germany's important. You know, surplus countries, you know, Switzerland, you know, whether it's Norway, whether it's Germany, the Netherlands, there's a lot of money there, right? Germany's current account surplus is larger than China's, but it's the Germans' money. They don't have to transfer it. So they've done some, you know, more banking union. They've talked more about transfers here and there. They're not going to go all the way like the United States of Europe, but I see some progress being put in place, building blocks. And the Germans are now pulling in unemployed Spaniards with highly skilled education and training them. That's a positive sign. You know, I think the Germans get beat up. Oh, they don't care. You know, they just want, you know, they don't this and that, and it gets pretty nasty historically speaking. But you know, this is a big family feud that I think is slowly, you know, kind of settling down. But I agree with you in the sense that who speaks? What is Europe? Is it Greece? Is it Italy? North or south? Is it Germany? Is it Switzerland? Is it the UK? I mean, the UK, I can't believe they're having this conversation. Should we leave the EU? I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, what else would you do without the EU? Right? I mean, so I don't understand that conversation. But, so we'll see how it plays out, but I think geostrategically, we have to think US and Europe, like if we want to compete against and, you know, kind of, if we want to maintain the status quo of the last 60 years, which has created the greatest increase in global prosperity in the last 200-300 years, we have to kind of keep the keys. China doesn't want to drive the world, right? India can't drive the world. The Brazilians are crazy drivers. We can give the keys to them anyways. The emerging markets, have you noticed? They're not living up to their expectations that, oh, we're going to drive global growth now. China's in deep trouble, deep, deep trouble. Read this book, Stumbling Giant, and there's other ones out there percolating, that when you look at the environmental issues, the food security, the water, they've got some huge challenges, and everyone knows that, including the Chinese. The Indians, forget it, right? Forget it. I mean, you got 300 million, you think it's hot out here now? There's 300 million people sitting in India with no air conditioning, with no electricity. And if you've ever been in India, it's hot there. This looks like the Swiss Alps. It's pretty cool relative to India. 300 million people, the size of the United States population basically, without electricity? I mean, come on, if that country's going to rule the world, we're all in trouble, right? That's how I kind of look at it. Brazil, we'll see. You know, a lot of fluff, you know, a lot of talk, no action. They've got they've kind of fallen into that resource trap, the natural resource trap, in the sense that they woke up last year and said, oh my God, 2/3 of our exports are primary commodities, and guess what? The big Chinese machine just went down. And now we're like, oh my God. They just had their oh my God moment. Like, we're uncompetitive, we have no manufacturing, we've got all these college graduates, and what are they doing? They're leaving, most of them. And then Russia, forget it. I mean, it's, you know, very corrupt, it's a one-trick pony, the best and brightest left, and they're not there. Africa we're bullish on, but you know, they've got a lot of work to do as well. So to me, global governance, global growth, continued development towards the middle classes of the emerging markets has to be led by the United States and Europe. And I think Europe will come around, but your point's well taken. What is Europe? That's the issue. What is Europe? They can't all be like Germans, but you know, you can be more like, you know, the north in Italy, for instance, very competitive. There's parts of Spain that's very competitive and so forth. So it'll merge. I think with the BRICS, we shouldn't sell this as us against them. Actually, we should sell it to the BRICS like, here's the standards that we've mutually agreed upon. They're for the benefit of our environment, for our workers, our communities, and so forth. And I don't think the Chinese or the Brazilians or the Indians or South Africans, they're going to disagree, but you know, there's company interest, corporate stakes. There's corporate interest at stake, I should say. So we'll see, but we shouldn't go down this path and make it non-discriminatory towards the Chinese. But you know, but if you're China, let's face it, you're paranoid right now, right? And for all the good reasons, right? You got the Transatlantic, you got TTIP underway, which could, like, you know, put the Chinese at a competitive disadvantage in a big, you know, transatlantic economy. Then you've got, you know, the Trans-Pacific trade agreement going on, and they're not invited into it. And so, you know, if I was China, I'd be like, gee, you know, does anyone like me? You know, I've got all this money, I do all this good in Africa, and I'm, you know, trying to like be a good global player, so to speak. And they have every right to feel paranoid. India, you know, we're not even going to go with India. I don't think Japan is going to kind of fess up and be a good partner in the Trans-Pacific. And the automobile manufacturers are very against Japan in the Trans-Pacific. So I think this president and the USTA has got a lot on their plate. Can they pull it off? We'll see. But it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of minefields here. Can we overcome it? Because why did Doha fail? Because of special interests. I remember 08 and 09. I mean, it was pretty vicious what the Europeans were saying to us about you can't run an economy, you can't run a banking sector, don't tell us what to do. The Chinese were in our face, the Brazilians were laughing, the Russians were like just rubbing their hands, right? But lo and behold, it's 5 years since the anniversary in September 2013. Who has the most competitive, resilient economy on earth, bar none, including China? America. Because corporations are profit-driven, they cut costs, they use automation, robotics, the cost of capital is very cheap, and our energy equation is hugely important. And oh, by the way, for the Europeans in the ground, our carbon footprint is back to the levels of 1992 now. So don't stop, I say like, when I was stop lecturing me about global climate change, because we're back, I don't know, we're not sure how it happened, but nevertheless, it was an accident, not by design. Our carbon, so we sometimes, kind of being the bridge between the U.S. and Europe, it would help if we just listened to each other once in a while. We kind of don't listen, and and that's kind of like a 30-year marriage. It's like, oh, I know what he's going to say, so it's just we got to start listening to each other and kind of feeling each other's pain, and then we'll work towards it. So, this is an inflection point for a long marriage that could hit the rocks and blow up the world economy. I mean, it's not that dire. I mean, but if we wait for Europe to get its act together, we'll be waiting forever. It's got to be, it's the bicycle. You got to keep it moving forward. It's not, it's not moving smoothly forward. But if it falls over, then you got a problem. I'm amazed with the global trade collapsing. And a lot of by America, by India, by Britain, there wasn't more protectionism coming out of the crisis. We've done a decent job. There's a lot of stealth and protectionism out there. China's doing it, we're doing it, everyone's doing it, but it hasn't kind of morphed into something that's a trade war. Should we Fed tapering? Yeah, I mean this economy is not driven solely off cheap capital. Now, cheap capital is important. It's a lubricant for economic activity. The Europeans haven't figured this out. Draghi needs to cut interest rates now, quantitative easing, print until he's blue in the face. He can't because the Germans won't let him, or they disagree with that. But who's in the catbird seat when it comes to growth, falling unemployment, corporate earnings being pretty robust, moving on to the next phase of technology, social media, robotics, 3D printing? The United States. And China's going in reverse, Europe is stuck in the mud, and we're going forward. Now, we're only going forward at 2%, but we're going forward. That's hugely important. The federal budget deficit is going to be half the level it was the last fiscal year because it's growth. And Washington, without realizing it, they raise taxes, cut spending, and oh my God, the fiscal position. The Europeans they're just flabbergasted at our luck, and it is some of it's just dumb luck, in the sense that. We've got this oil and gas revolution here, which, by the way, Washington had virtually nothing to do with, right? It was done by small independent contractors with good state policies, with a risk capital and technology. And that's the DNA of our economy, right? Risk capital, entrepreneurship, small guys trying to hit home runs, and lo and behold, they changed the global energy equation. Most of the shale gas and oil has come from non-federal lands. And if we ever get to the federal lands, we're going to blow the place up. And the Europeans want our energy. This is TTIP should be part, energy security. And Europe is beholden to Russia, which sometimes they give them the gas, sometimes they don't. It's middle of winter. I was over in Slovakia in the middle of winter, freezing, because the Russians a couple of years ago decided, like, you know what, we're just going to cut off the gas because we're a little annoyed with you people. Freeze a couple of nights and then we'll talk again. That's just power politics. So it's incumbent, there's so many, to me, that energy's low-hanging fruit here. But that's more of a U.S. issue than in cases in Europe. So long story, no, we shouldn't wait. No. We can do many things. We need to multitask. And I was, I think, it's important for the United States and China to have this strategic dialogues, keep that moving forward. We just can't shut the door on China and say, like, we'll get back to you later. No, you have to do everything, all at once. And quite frankly, I don't know if we have the manpower down in Washington to be doing everything we should be doing. I agree with two other things you said about China. The coal but when I disagree, they're not pulling 11-year kids out of school and putting them in a factory. They don't do that. They do not do that. Not today, not in this decade. They're much more on the international standards of the United States, GATT and so forth. So they're not doing it. They may do that in Bangladesh, parts of Africa. They don't do that in China. In China, they're going to school, particularly girls. And the girls don't want to work in factories anymore. This is the problem for China. China's had a huge problem. Girls don't want to come into the interior and work in a polluted factory anymore. And that's a huge issue. Are they devaluing the currencies? Not really. If actually the currency has appreciated over the last 5 or 6 years. Who's devaluing the currency? The good old United States. I mean, we're out there printing money. So, but to your point, is trade beneficial? I think absolutely, because if the Chinese can make tennis rackets cheaper than you and I, fine. But make sure you buy our aircraft, right? I mean, think about it. They have to, trade is all about you export so you can import, right? So they have to make 800 million t-shirts to buy one aircraft. Who's got the better deal? Us. So that's what trade is all about, mutually beneficial. So, and to me, we, the United States and Europe, should take a bow and applaud ourselves, because I applaud China for lifting millions of people out of poverty, but they wouldn't have done it without the trading system we created. We let them in 1979, 80. They were smart to join. The Indians, they're not smart enough to get in the program. Get on the same field as us, and you will lift millions out of poverty. So they're a work in progress. There's no doubt about that. Environmentally, food, there's a run on milk formula, because the Chinese don't trust giving their precious kids or kid milk formula. So there's a global run on milk formula. There are people just fly to New Zealand to buy all the milk formula, get back on the plane, and then sell it in China. And so I think their willingness to make product for us that we shouldn't be making, we passed on a long time ago, that puts more money in our pocket. And by the way, there's now the costs are rising so much in China that the Chinese are now taking that plant out of Guangdong province and putting it into Cambodia right now. It's got the Chinese all upset. And I'll give you, I could go on and on, but the Chinese are in trouble. Why? Because if you look at manufacturing overall, if you look at the numbers from the UN, the United States and China basically produce the same amount manufactured each year, 1.75 trillion. Okay, there's this huge ignorance in the United States that we don't make anything anymore. That's just utter nonsense. It's like it just makes us all dumber and stupider than we already are, in terms of being economically illiterate. But here's the gist: we produce about the same amount manufacturing in the United States and China. However, we only use 10.5 million workers. They need 100 million to produce the same amount. Who's more efficient, more productive, more competitive? Where do you want to live? Where do you want to invest? Here in the United States. And what's going to happen? Guangdong province today is exactly where Ohio and Michigan were in the 1980s. Rising labor costs, stronger currencies, more unions, and they're going to get blown out. The automation, robotics. Have you ever heard of 3D printing, right? 3D printing. You and I pretty soon will be able to go online at Nike and make our own sneakers, right? Through 3D printing. We're going to upload it, you can stitch it here, and when we do that, who is in trouble? The Chinese. Because all those jobs are going. Foxconn, the Taiwanese foundry company over in China, they don't want to use people anymore. They want to use robots, automation. So they're in deep trouble. But I think they'll rise to the occasion, but we can't be, kind of like, well, you're getting yours, and that's why I don't like us kind of, leaving them out, because they do feel left out. When you feel left out, you don't feel warm and fuzzy about people, and that's just human nature. They have feelings. I think sometimes we forget that. They have feelings too. So I think trade is beneficial, but the problem with trade is it's become much more task-oriented. We don't trade in goods like anymore. It's more service-related than anything. Ireland is so important. It makes one particular component, and then it sends it on to the UK that does something, that sends it on maybe to another part, and then it finally reaches the consumer as it passes through one more. The UN, IMF, around 20% of total global trade is double counted, right? And so it's interesting how we're going to delve deeper. The last comment I'll say about China is simply this. A lot of academic studies have been done on the iPod, right? You've seen it in Berkeley and so forth. The iPod, what's it cost? We pay too much. But I think it's like what, $250? I think the example is $250, right? So all those iPods come from China. It blows out the trade deficit we have with China. But when you look at how much does the Chinese out of $250, I'm using that round number, $250, you know how much China accrues, how much value they get from that? About $3-4. Who gets all the value? Apple and some British designers in the foundry in Taiwan. The Chinese hardly get any of it. And so who's in the better position? Let them make iPods. It's cheaper. And the profits all go to shareholders of Apple and their workers. That creates jobs here in the United States. So, on and on. So I'm a big proponent of global trade being win-win. Are there dislocations? Is there, there's no such thing as free trade, in my opinion. That's managed trade, but it just has to be managed smartly, with recognizing that the more we do this, the better off we all are. But and that's important. And China's a good global player. I mean, just compare China, good global player, with India. I mean, India's going no place because they're not on the level play. They're not willing to step up and play on the playing field we have.
Just a quick question, kind of on the other sphere. You said you're bullish on Africa. Is that because there's nowhere else to go but up in Africa?
No, I just think that, there's a lot of good, Africa's 58 countries, 59 some days, depending on how you look at it sometimes. But there's expectations. The greatest thing that ever happened to Africa was what? Cell phones. Cell phones. In the hands of women, in the hands of traders, fishermen, and they realize that they can be more efficient and so forth about going about their business, and they want to succeed now. They want things you and I take for granted. Some of these governments are much more market friendly. They pulled in a lot of Chinese investment. I have no problem the Chinese investing in Africa, no problem at all. If they want to go to Sudan and pull out oil that puts more oil in the global bathtub, that makes it cheaper for you and I, go for it. So, but I know the State Department doesn't feel that way, and I understand our position. But there's an emerging market middle class in Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, and it's very exciting. The key will be women. Women are key. Go to school. Go to school, don't fetch water, right, or cook. And don't get married, at 13, 14. That's huge, and that's what's happening. Women are changing the tide in Africa. The bigger issue, can women ever change the tide in the Middle East? That's a whole different story, because the Middle East will never get its act together until the women are running the place. So we'll see. So that's why we're optimistic about it. Africa's growing by 4, 5, 6%. And if you talk to a lot of U.S. corporations, they'll tell you, listen, we're not making any money in Europe, but from Europe, we're sending product into North Africa, and it's really helping, offset the weakness on the continent. I was just up in Norway, and the street cleaner makes $85,000 a year, and he's got health care for life. He's loving life, and he sweeps he's cleaning the street Saturday morning. I don't know how they afford that. Yeah, but they've got a gravy train up there that won't last forever. But demographics matter, sure, and that's why I'm bullish on the United States. We're a young population. I keep hearing, we're the aging. We're young, and if we're smart about immigration, we'll get even younger. Japan, I don't like Japan. I didn't say Japan. Japan's important. But demographically, there's villages in Japan when the last person dies, there's no more village. There's no more village. They're big on robotics, though. Robotics. Robotics in some parts in Japan are almost humanized. Which is a little scary. That's kind of out there. The demographics of Europe, they're not favorable, but you're still talking 500 million people right now that are pretty darn wealthy, relatively speaking. Just look at, say, the Poles' per capita income versus India's. Look at Slovakia versus, China. This is how you have to look at it. And this nonsense that China's, we got this kind of nonsense, the media, China that could be the world's largest economy, pretty soon, who cares? They're still going to be dirt poor. It's per capita income. It's not GDP. If they produce the same amount of output with 1.2 billion people versus our 320 million, which economy do you want to live in? That one or ours? I'm going to get on a rant here, but we're just economically illiterate. And that frustrates the Europeans and the Chinese, because the world knows more about us than we know them, and that's kind of I'm tired of that. Could the U.S. go it alone, or craft a deal with China? A G2. I don't believe in the G2 world, but I look at it from a post-war world, post-war architects. The trading environment, the investment agreements, just the standard of living and so forth. It's been the United States and Europe working together. We needed Europe in many cases. NATO, very important. in the Middle East. I mean, the French do a lot in Africa, when it comes to security. So we need a partner. Richard Haas, and we don't want to be the sheriff to the world. I don't want to be a sheriff either. So if we're not going to be a sheriff, we need partners to kind of help us out, in time of need, like the Brits, the Poles, the Canadians. We need coalitions of willing. So I think, economically speaking, that the prosperity we enjoy, you and I, that we take for granted. I tell my clients that all the time. They're always complain, oh, geez, so go to India. I'll keep picking on India. And come back and tell me how bad this country is relative to India. The prosperity, the economic prosperity of the United States in Europe have created in the last 60 years is unprecedented. Peace, prosperity, unprecedented. And we had a good partner. So I think, I worry maybe last chance a little melodramatic perhaps, but it is the last chance, I think, for the United States and Europe to kind of keep that marriage intact and avoid a divorce. Because we get divorced or go our separate ways, or like the Germans say, well, forget it, we're just going to throw our lot in with the Russians. And a lot of German companies have done that. I don't know if you know that. It's very interesting that German-Russian, there's a lot going on there they don't want to talk about. But there's nothing wrong with it. But so, and Europe being Muslim, there's a big Muslim pop, but I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, that's not necessarily, evil in that sense. I mean, it's interesting when you go, you walk down parts of, the Hague and other parts of the Netherlands, what you see. But to me, that's globalization. That's a good thing. I have no problem with that. No problem at all. But the key is, the Middle East, right at their doorstep. That's a big vacuum. I don't like what's, my research spans the world, and when I see big pockets of, violence and, disconnected people, then, globalization could be, it isn't fully in bloom, in that sense. So globalization has benefited the American worker who's also a consumer. You can't separate the two. And the workers here in the United States, if you're working for Ford Motor right now, or General Motors, it was a darn good thing in 2008, 2009, 2010 that sales in China were off the chart, because that saved your job sitting in Michigan. So globalization cuts way. I mean, it's impacted U.S. workers and consumers beneficially. I have no doubt about that. And oh, by the way, globalization, capital flows, the Chinese buying over $1 trillion of our securities help keep our interest rates low, so that worker working could buy a house at a cost of capital that was very affordable for him. So on and on. Are there dislocations? Are there winners and losers? Absolutely. But the net effect is a global economy that's on its way to $100 trillion in output. That's a good thing. So we're not an island. I'm very optimistic about this U.S. economy, but not as a standalone entity. No way. It has to be in Europe, it has to be in the Middle East, it has to be all over. That's where the consumption is. So the U.S. worker has benefited from globalization, unequivocally, I believe. I wouldn't, forecast or make a bet that we'll never have another financial crisis. I mean, whether it's in the U.S., it could be China, could be that could be the next stop. Bubbles are a fact of economic life. But here in the United States, the banks are well capitalized, more regulation. You've got CEOs that are more risk averse than ever before. You've got compliance people. Is the banking sector safe and sound? I would say yes. Are there risks in that? Yes, but there always are. And so our banks are well capitalized, and we're working with the regulators and so forth. It's Europe's the problem. I do worry about Europe. They're undercapitalized. They didn't have a stress test. There's a lot of kind of funny things going on there, but I would say I worry about financial deglobalization. This is a whole other different topic, because I'm worried when the German banks and Irish banks leave the United States, you have a huge sell-off in each other's assets. When Citibank leaves Turkey, for instance, peeling back. On and on. Financial globalization greased the wheels for trade and services later on that knitted the world together and made it all better for you and I as it is. If we start to backtrack financial deglobalization, then capital stays home, then maybe manufacturers or say stay home as well. I mean, I disagree with the president, with this reshoring. I don't want U.S. companies coming home. I want them to stay abroad because that's where smart people are. That's where you can leverage capital, people. You can learn about cultures. I mean, we don't need we need everything. And I want more foreign companies to come here. So, I mean, I'm not going to comment on the banking sector. We're not here to talk about that, and particularly because I come from Bank of America. But I will tell you, our banking sector is pretty well capitalized. It's in good shape. And I give a lot of credit to Ben Bernanke for that. Ben Bernanke, Paulson, Geithner, and all the watchdogs work. And there's a new CEO out there running Wall Street, and they're not cowboys. They're very much Tier 1 capital, Basel III. I mean, we've got a lot of capital out there. We'll start to deploy it. So I'm not worried about that. But will there be another financial bubble? Yes. I'll go out on a limb, because that's the human nature. Look at 200-300 years of economics. So it'll teach you that.